So I didn't have any problems with saying what I didn't think was funny. No, I don't believe that. Why does he say that?
When a television show becomes so controversial that it literally disappears from the air, you know something extraordinary happened. Today, we're diving deep into one of British television's most shocking moments, the infamous scene that essentially ended one of history's greatest comedy programs before its time. This is the story of Fawlty Towers, a masterpiece of comedic writing that burned so brightly it couldn't help but ignite a firestorm that would change television forever. If you've ever watched Fawlty Towers, you know its brilliance wrapped in chaos. The show followed Basil Fawlty, a hotel manager perpetually on the verge of a nervous breakdown, as he navigated the absurdities of running a small seaside hotel with his long-suffering wife, Sybil. Created by John Cleese and Connie Booth, the series became a cultural phenomenon. But beneath the brilliance was always an edge, a willingness to push boundaries that would eventually push too hard. The question everyone asks is, what was so bad that it could end a show that people loved? The answer is more complicated than you might think, and it involves race, language, and the changing standards of what television audiences would tolerate. It's a story about art, controversy, and how a single moment can overshadow decades of achievement. To understand what happened, we first need to understand what Fawlty Towers was and why it mattered so much. The show premiered in 1975 and represented something revolutionary in British comedy. Unlike the sketch-based humor that dominated the era, Fawlty Towers was a sitcom with genuine dramatic tension, character development, and stakes. Every episode felt like watching a pressure cooker about to explode. Basil Fawlty, played brilliantly by John Cleese, was a neurotic, social-climbing snob who desperately wanted his hotel to be a five-star establishment. The problem? He was running a modest three-star operation, and he seemed to actively sabotage himself at every turn. He was rude to guests, dismissive of his staff, and constantly at odds with his wife Sybil, whose booming voice could be heard even when she was off-screen, threatening him with violence. What made Fawlty Towers exceptional was its structural sophistication. Episodes weren't just strung-together jokes, they had clear three-act structures with escalating complications. One of the most famous episodes involved Basil trying to hide the fact that a guest had died in the hotel. Another involved an outbreak of food poisoning. The comedy came from watching intelligent people make increasingly desperate decisions to solve problems that spiraled out of control. The show only lasted 2 seasons. This wasn't because it was canceled outright. It ended because John Cleese and Connie Booth felt they'd said what they needed to say with the format. They wanted to go out on top before the show became tired or repetitive. This decision to quit while ahead gave Fawlty Towers a legendary status it might never have achieved otherwise. But then came the episode that changed everything. It came in the second season, and it aired in 1975. The episode was titled The Germans, and while it's now infamous for what it portrayed, the writer's intentions were actually quite different from how audiences initially perceived it. To truly understand the controversy, we need to talk about what the episode was actually trying to do. The Germans followed a fairly standard Fawlty Towers formula. Guests arrive, Basil embarrasses himself, complications ensue, chaos erupts. In this case, the guests were a group of German tourists. Basil had recently suffered a minor head injury and was acting increasingly paranoid and unstable. The episode played on a very old British comedy tradition, the idea of awkwardness around Germans, with undercurrents of post-World War II anxiety. This wasn't unique to Fawlty Towers. British comedy had been mining this particular vein for decades. The premise was that Basil, worried about offending the German guests, would become increasingly neurotic about making references to World War II. His attempts to be inoffensive would become so absurd that he'd inevitably say something offensive anyway. It's a classic comedy structure. The more you try to avoid something, the more likely you are to encounter it anyway. The humor was supposed to be at Basil's expense. The joke wasn't meant to be, Germans are funny or World War II is funny. The joke was that Basil's paranoia and social anxiety would lead him to make an absolute fool of himself. This was consistent with how the show treated its protagonist throughout its run. Basil was always the butt of the joke, never the clever one who outsmarted others. But here's where things get complicated. Within that framing, there was a specific moment, a particular phrase that Basil uttered, that crossed into territory that was, at the time and certainly in retrospect, deeply problematic. The word was a racial slur, used in a particular historical context that made it especially loaded. The specific phrase in question involved Basil making a reference that used language from Nazi ideology. Specifically, he made a comment that evoked Nazi racial terminology. This wasn't gratuitous. It was part of a scene where Basil, in his neurotic state, was trying to explain something and accidentally invoked this language. Now, here's the key thing to understand. The scene was written in a way where the characters around Basil immediately reacted with shock and disapproval. Sybil was horrified. The other characters made clear that what he'd said was unacceptable. The show itself was, in a sense, condemning what Basil had said. However, and this is crucial, that distinction between the character did something bad and faced consequences versus the show is endorsing this behavior didn't matter to many viewers. What mattered was that the word had been broadcast. The context, the framing, the point the show was making, all of that could feel secondary to the simple fact that an offensive racial term had been spoken on television. This is a genuinely difficult issue in comedy and drama. When you depict something offensive to criticize it, do you need to constantly remind the audience that you're criticizing it? How explicit does the condemnation need to be? These are questions that artists, networks, and audiences still grapple with today. At the time the episode aired, reactions were mixed. Some people found the episode hilarious. Basil's neurotic attempts at political correctness gone wrong felt very much in keeping with the show's sensibility. Others were deeply offended and felt that no amount of framing could justify putting that language on television. The episode didn't immediately end the show. Fawlty Towers continued to air and continued to be beloved by millions of viewers. The show became a cultural touchstone. It won awards. It was repeated constantly. It spawned discussions, analyses, and cultural commentary. Decades later, it would be regularly ranked among the greatest television comedies ever made. But the controversy never quite went away. In the 1990s and 2000s, as society's standards around language and representation continued to evolve, the question of that episode became more pointed. How should we handle art that contains offensive elements? Should we pretend they never existed? Should we remove the offending content? Should we air it with disclaimers? Different networks and broadcasters came to different conclusions. Some stations stopped showing The Germans entirely. Others aired it, but with content warnings. Still others continued to show it without any modifications, arguing that censoring art after the fact was its own form of problematic behavior. The real turning point came as Britain's media landscape shifted. The BBC, which had originally broadcast the show, became increasingly cautious about airing the episode, not because they necessarily disagreed with it, but because they anticipated public backlash and didn't want to deal with the inevitable complaints and controversies. By the 2000s, the situation had become almost absurd. A show celebrated as one of the greatest comedies ever made was essentially being treated like something too dangerous to show. The episode wasn't banned outright, exactly, but it was increasingly unavailable through official channels. It became something that existed in the show's history as this dark secret that everyone knew about, but nobody wanted to deal with. Throughout this entire controversy, John Cleese has been consistent in defending the episode and his intentions in writing it. Cleese has argued passionately that the scene was anti-fascist, not pro-fascist. He's pointed out that the other characters in the scene immediately condemned what Basil said, and that Basil himself was portrayed as ridiculous and wrong. Cleese has also made the broader argument that comedy sometimes needs to touch uncomfortable places to be effective. He suggested that by making the phrase completely unspeakable, by treating it as something so toxic that it can't even be mentioned in a context that's clearly critical of it, we might actually be giving it more power rather than less. This is a perspective that resonates with some people and enrages others. Some argue that Cleese is being precious about criticism, using the shield of "it's just comedy" to avoid accountability. Others believe he's right, that context matters, that the show was clearly anti-racist in its sensibilities, and that erasing art after the fact solves nothing. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The episode was written with good intentions, or at least with the intention of satirizing Basil's neurotic racism rather than endorsing it. But good intentions don't always translate into good results. Language is powerful, and sometimes, even when it's used critically, its power to hurt can outweigh its intended satirical purpose. What's fascinating about the Fawlty Towers controversy is how it raises questions that are still relevant today. How do we deal with art from the past that contains elements we now find deeply problematic? Do we erase it? Do we keep it exactly as it was? Do we add context? Do we edit it? There's no perfect answer. Museums grapple with this when displaying art that's offensive by modern standards. Streaming services grapple with it when deciding what warnings to put on older films and television shows. Publishers grapple with it when re-releasing books that contain dated language or problematic representations. One approach is the historical document approach. We leave things as they were because they show us where society was at a particular moment in time. This has value, but it can also feel like we're asking people who are harmed by that history to essentially re-experience the harm in the name of historical accuracy. Another approach is aggressive editing. Remove the problematic content, update it, change it. But this raises its own questions about whether we have the right to alter art, and about whether we're being honest about what the work actually was and said. A third approach is contextualization. Air the content, but provide significant framing and disclaimers. This arguably lets people make informed choices about what they're engaging with. But it can also feel like we're trying to have it both ways. We want to air the offensive content, but also want credit for criticizing it. The ironic thing is that Fawlty Towers didn't really come off the air in the traditional sense. The show ended because its creators chose to end it. But the controversy around the Germans episode essentially created a second ending, an ending where the show became something that couldn't be easily discussed or shown. In recent years, there's been some slight shift. The episode has been made available again on some platforms, usually with content warnings. Networks have started airing it again, though often with apologies or explanations before and after. It's as if society has finally figured out a way to live with the discomfort. Acknowledge it, provide context, but don't pretend it doesn't exist. John Cleese remains unrepentant about the episode, which some find admirable and others find frustrating. He's continued to defend the show and its artistic integrity. He's also become something of a lightning rod for broader debates about cancel culture and free speech, which has sometimes overshadowed the specific substance of the Fawlty Towers debate. What's clear is that Fawlty Towers remains one of the greatest sitcoms ever made. The show's structural brilliance, the quality of the writing, the performances, these are all undeniable. The problematic episode doesn't erase the rest of the show's achievements. But it also doesn't just disappear because we want it to. The infamous scene that took Fawlty Towers off the air is a microcosm of larger debates we're still having about art, language, intention, and harm. It's a story about how even brilliant artists working with good intentions can create something that causes pain. It's a story about how societies change and how we grapple with art that doesn't fit our current values. Fawlty Towers remains a masterpiece. Basil Fawlty remains one of television's greatest characters. The show's influence on comedy is immeasurable, but it's also a show that contains a moment that hurt people, and that complexity is something we have to sit with. We can't erase it, and we probably shouldn't. But we also shouldn't ignore that it caused harm. The episode is a reminder that context matters, that intention isn't everything, and that even great artists operating in good faith can create moments that don't age well. It's a reminder that comedy that punches down or relies on harmful language as its vehicle, no matter how cleverly framed, carries consequences. But it's also a reminder that art is complicated, that history is complicated, and that maybe the answer isn't to erase difficult moments, but to understand them, to examine what happened, why it happened, and what we learned from it. Fawlty Towers didn't come off the air because of one episode. It came off the air because its creators decided to end it while they were still ahead. But that episode has complicated the show's legacy in ways that are still being worked through today. And perhaps that's actually the most honest and appropriate way to reckon with it.